Honourable members, the prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and to her government, to members of the Legislative Assembly and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power or desire to please, but laying aside all private interest and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Amen. Please be seated.
Introduction of visitors, introduction of guests, ministerial statements, member statements.
The honourable member for Lac-Saint Anne Parkland has a statement to make.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our world and our nation are facing a global pandemic. Here in Canada, not only are we facing a global pandemic, we're facing a potential blood shortage. Our healthcare workers are amazing people that deserve our thanks. But at this time, they also need our help to ensure they have some of the necessary supplies to save lives. I've talked recently about people coming together and helping their neighbours through this difficult time. This is no different, Mr. Speaker. Understandably, some citizens have cancelled their blood donation appointments, likely in an effort to social distance for the good of their community. However, with the COVID-19 affecting the world as we know it, there's still a need for blood. Individuals diagnosed with cancer, folks who've been in trauma accidents, and individuals undergoing surgery all require blood donations. The need for the blood does not stop just because of COVID-19. In fact, you will likely need more because of COVID-19. Blood centres are still open, and according to Canadian Blood Services, eligible donors are still able to donate blood. Blood centres have not closed their doors. In fact, blood centres maintained a strict protocol in cleanliness and the guidelines of their centres even before the outbreak of the coronavirus. And given the current climate, their protocols have amplified. A recent statement from Canadian Blood Services states that all potential donors are carefully screened both at the time of booking of the appointment and at the time of donating the blood. Potential donors exhibiting symptoms of any kind at any time are asked to leave. Dr. Levy from the Canadian Blood Services stated that donor centres are islands of wellness within the Canadian health system. They are not places where sick people gather, but where healthy people gather to aid those who are sick. Canadian Blood Services is highly concerned about the blood shortage and is urging healthy, scheduled donors to keep their donation appointments. Mr. Speaker, donating blood saves lives, and so I would encourage anyone who is eligible to consider giving blood. And I'd like many of my fellow UCP MLAs, we wouldn't ask others to do something we weren't able to do ourselves. So on March 31st, all the UCP caucus is donating, and I encourage everyone else to do the same. Thank you.
Next on my list is the honourable member for Edmonton-McClung, followed by the member for Calgary-Klein, followed by the member for Edmonton-Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have heard concerns from Indigenous communities about their inclusion in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We've heard the Premier and Minister saying that he was impressed by the preparations done by Indigenous communities for the coronavirus pandemic following a conference call. While it is encouraging to hear that Indigenous communities are taking all the steps necessary, it becomes more and more urgent for Indigenous communities to receive updates on what exactly the provincial plan is to enable them to best combat this pandemic. Unfortunately, so far we've heard little from the government on what specific steps they are planning to adequately support our Indigenous communities. From what we understand from the Minister of Health, there is no extra funding in the updated budget that is targeted to Indigenous communities to support them in this pandemic. And in question period earlier this week, the House was notified by the Minister of Health that there are no dollars identified to be sent to on-reserve health centres to ensure adequate preparations. I'm very concerned that this government is waiting yet again for the federal government to step in and meet the needs of Indigenous Albertans. The misuse of the jurisdictional divide argument at this time is both problematic and worrying. Indigenous Albertans are Albertans. Does not matter where they live, on reserve or off, on settlement or off. Many Indigenous people fall within the definition of high vulnerability to COVID-19. As Dr. Yu agreed 2 weeks ago in the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, it is not adequate to expect Indigenous patients to simply attend programs designed for the general public because there are a number of systemic barriers. We were told to wait for the budget to be passed, and that it was urgent to pass this specific budget to have the necessary supports. The budget is passed now, and Indigenous communities are, as far as we know, still waiting for specific information. I call on the government to let our Indigenous communities know today what steps they are taking. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary-Klein.
Mr. Speaker, I worked in shelters during the SARS outbreak in 2003 and the H1N1 outbreak in 2009. Unfortunately, neither of these viruses had a devastating impact on the homeless population. At the time, we installed hand washing stations at every door. We made sanitizer available for every staff and volunteer. We did our best to promote social distancing and create a separate space for individuals with symptoms. We increased our staffing levels to assist with the non-stop task of cleaning and disinfecting. Most importantly, we worked together as a community, staff, donors, volunteers, community partners, the guests in our programs, and even our politicians united in one cause. 2 days ago, members of the opposition made statements about shelter funding that were factually untrue and are once again attempting to create undue fear for our most vulnerable citizens. This rhetoric creates division in a time when we should be united and working together. The truth is that we have maintained funding for all of the province's shelters. The government has also committed an additional $11 million for expanding shelter spaces for both Red Deer and Edmonton. We've put $140 million for mental health and addiction recovery, which will have an impact. To make matters worse, the NDP insinuated negligence on the government's part in supporting the homeless and organizations that are set up to help. These comments were neither helpful nor constructive and are the complete opposite of what Albertans need from us at this time. Yesterday, I was named Parliamentary Secretary for Civil Society, and I look forward to working with the Minister of Community and Social Services and all of our civil society partners, as well as with all members of this House. Now is a time when we need to come together. And I invite the NDP to join with our government in its response to this pandemic and protect those who are most vulnerable in our community. Albertans need us to push aside partisan rhetoric and work constructively together to address this crisis. Thank you.
The honourable member for Edmonton-McClung.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are in the midst of unprecedented times in Alberta. The pandemic of COVID-19 has sparked uncertainty for all Albertans. At this moment, cases of COVID-19 are mostly concentrated in cities, but the rest of the province must be prepared now. The time to practice social distancing is now. The time for the government to tell Albertans how they are going to make it through these economically anxious times is now. People living paycheck to paycheck need to know how they will be able to afford rent, to keep a roof over their head, and to pay for groceries, to keep food in their fridge. However, in these uncertain times, I am inspired by the resilience of rural communities. I think of the many droughts over time that farmers have experienced. I think of the many families who immigrated to Alberta because of their home country's experience with famine or war. The days ahead look difficult, Mr. Speaker. In anxious and uncertain times, friends and family want to spend time together and hold each other closer to make it through. Practices of social distancing and self-isolation change how we physically cope through this. Spring break and Easter trips to friends and family have had to be canceled. Places of worship, which are pillars for many communities, have been forced to cancel services during some of the holiest times on their religious calendars. Although we have had to create more physical distance between us, it does not mean we are not connected. We are connected through our proud history and our common values. By caring for each other collectively, we can get through this. Albertans have been creative on how they use technology and the internet to stay connected with family, friends, and their religious communities. Mr. Speaker, yes, these times are tough, and we need answers from the government on how we will make it through. But I am so inspired by Albertans taking this seriously and looking out for each other. We will make it through this by acting and working together as we have always done in the past.
The honourable member for Cardston-Siksika.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Albertans are concerned. They're concerned for their own health, that of their families, and their friends. With non-stop images of empty grocery store shelves and public spaces, Albertans, Canadians, and people across the globe are left feeling scared, confused, frightened, and some in a state of panic. There's no question the COVID-19 pandemic is a serious situation, but with simple personal hygiene practices and following the recommendations of Alberta's Chief Medical Officer, we will get ahead of the virus and flatten the curve. I want to take this opportunity to assure Albertans that our government is doing everything we can to responsibly monitor the COVID-19 situation and react appropriately. We are taking the recommendations of Alberta's Chief Medical Officer seriously, and although the cancellation of sporting events, conferences, and other public gatherings may result in the next few weeks being a bit boring for many Albertans. They are necessary measures that will ensure the health and safety of all of us, as we are responsible for each other. But where there is darkness, Mr. Speaker, there is also light. The stories have been seen on social media of friends helping friends, neighbors helping neighbors, and strangers helping strangers, and it's truly heartwarming. It's the Alberta way. It shows that through uncertain times, we pull together for one another, that our greater Alberta community is looking out for one another, and that no one in the community will be left behind. Mr. Speaker, I know many Albertans are frightened and concerned, and certainly there's reason for it. The uncertainty of our economic future with the added stress of COVID-19 can be overwhelming for many. I know it's difficult to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but together we will reach that light. Albertans will persevere, Albertans will overcome, and these challenges and Alberta will thrive once again.
The honourable member for Calgary-McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are going through unsettling times. With Alberta undergoing the growing spread of COVID-19 pandemic, we must ensure our hardest hit areas are given the supports they need. With the majority of reported cases of COVID-19 coming out of Calgary, we must keep Calgary top of mind. As Albertans come home and travel through the airport, it is vital we are prepared. Critical steps and precautions are being taken, and we must continue to ensure they are taken. Announcements today to limit travel from the United States and Canada is another crucial step. I also commend WestJet for canceling their international flights. These are inconvenient but necessary steps to slow the spread of COVID-19 and keep Calgary and the rest of Alberta safe. I commend the City of Calgary for taking crucial steps and declaring a state of emergency early to ensure necessary precautions are taken. I'm grateful for the Chief Medical Officer's advice and her leadership in telling Albertans how to act through this. We have taken smart steps to limit the spread. However, we need answers from the government on how they will support Calgarians through these difficult times. Oil and gas spending has drastically decreased. Capital spending by oil and gas companies has been decreased by $3 billion. Calgarians are anxious on how they will make payments to rent, utilities, and afford groceries. We have heard today from the federal government that they are investing in ensuring Canadians are able to meet their basic needs. Calgarians and Albertans need to know what their provincial government is planning to do to make sure people get paid and are able to care for themselves and their families during these difficult times. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Vermilion, Lloydminster, Wainwright.
Mr. Speaker, in recent weeks, COVID-19 has spread across the world and into our province. My constituents, like all Albertans, are reasonable people. They just want to know the facts, and they want to protect their loved ones in these uncertain times. They understand there's a lot of uncertainty, but they want to know what the risk level is. When they see large events being postponed and they get asked to work from home, they become concerned. The reality is we should be taking very seriously while the risk to Albertans remains relatively low for the time being, this virus will continue to spread through our communities. That is why it's important for each of us to share the facts surrounding the virus and to share the advice of our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Dina Hinshaw. Her updates and other pertinent information can be found on alberta.ca/COVID. Our government MLAs and minister are constantly sharing these updates across social media, and I encourage my fellow Albertans to look for these updates. It is also vital at this time that Albertans share the new travel advisory and policies with their friends, neighbours, and family returning from abroad. The Cabinet Committee on Emergency Preparedness has accepted her recommendations that all returning travelers from outside of Canada should self-isolate for 2 weeks. The Premier has been clear that Alberta should not be leaving the country for leisure travel right now. Recently, the Prime Minister announced our borders would be closing to most people who don't hold citizenship or permanent residency in Canada. Yesterday, our Premier also announced that the Government of Alberta would be declaring a state of public health emergency, bringing in new measures to increase social distancing. If we want to protect the most vulnerable in our community, including seniors, children, and those with compromised immune systems, We must respect these policies. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues and all Albertans to consider this a call to action. Inform your constituents, inform your neighbours, hold one another accountable, and we must now consider a new norm.
The honourable member for St. Albert has a statement to make.
When I look back at my life so far, some of the greatest lessons I've learned happened during and following times of enormous stress and change. The death of someone I loved, watching someone I love fight for their life against a horrible disease, fear of the unknown. Right now, we're all facing an uncertain future, and we're collectively learning some important lessons. We're learning that although we're literally all trying to be alone by self-isolating, we're not alone because what each one of us chooses to do impacts us all. We're learning that we need each other to get through this, and we're learning that we need our public systems to be there for us, to give us factual information and leadership that will save lives. We're learning that we must appropriately care for those who are vulnerable, or we all become weaker. We're learning that we need transparent, democratic systems now more than ever. Last night I sat in this place and I watched this government put its own political agenda ahead of the people of Alberta when they chose to dismantle processes that keep our democracy intact, and it was tough to watch. I understand that we're in uncharted territory, but this is not the time to use the fog of uncertainty and distraction and fear to plow ahead with partisan goals. That's not leadership, and that is most certainly not the democracy that the men and women who for 100 years worked in this place to create systems, albeit clumsy and time-consuming, to protect democracy and well-being. When we all get through this, and we will, we'll remember the leaders who bravely stepped forward and demonstrated their commitment to Albertans and democracy. Albertans are smart. They see what's happening here, and they will learn from it.
The honourable member for Calgary East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we continue to make tough decisions, businesses across Alberta and Canada are doing what they can do, not only to help all affected by COVID-19, but also do what they can do to help reduce the spread of the virus. Some malls across Alberta have chosen to operate on restricted times along with the closing some attractions they host in their malls. Other businesses have also taken their precautions to protect not just their staff, but their customers as well. Some service providers are allowing access to additional services at no extra cost or eliminated service caps to the services they already provide to their customers, not only in Alberta, but Canada as well, to relieve the burden they may face in the coming days. Many grocery stores are creating special hours to help senior citizens get the supplies they need. Utility providers are allowing consumers additional payment flexibility, such as installment plans, payment date extensions, and suspending collections for the time being. All these actions help relieve the burden that Albertans are facing and mitigate the damage the virus is causing in both the present and the future. Having said that, I would like to remind everybody, Mr. Speaker, that we must observe all the necessary instructions and recommendations of our Chief Medical Officer and other health authorities in the prevention of the spread of COVID-19. For these initiatives, I would like to ask my colleagues to join me in thanking businesses for not only helping those in the time of need, but also helping to do their part in reducing the spread of COVID-19. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Presenting petitions. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills.
Honourable members, I think we're at oral question period, and the leader of Her Majesty's official opposition has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Over the last 3 days, this government has put off Albertans looking for details on income support, saying they had to wait for Ottawa. Now the feds have announced their details, we can see places where Albertans still need crucial provincial action. Federal support does not appear to begin until April 1st, but utility bills and mortgage payments are coming and it's 14 days until rent is due. So to the Premier, will he step up and use his authority to legislatively ban evictions and utility shutoffs? He must do so before April 1st.
The Honourable the Premier has the call.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, we completely understand the profound anxiety of families about their capacity to pay bills in these extremely trying circumstances. We appreciate the announcement by the Government of Canada today with respect to forthcoming emergency income measures and a significant expansion of the employment insurance benefits. The Government of Alberta will be making additional announcements this afternoon at 4 o'clock in this respect.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on that matter, we know the feds have offered $1,800 a month in terms of income support, and they've also increased the child benefit. This is welcome, but we know it falls far short of the monthly help that most Alberta families will need for food and shelter and electricity. So perhaps the Premier could give us a little bit of a heads up here in this House. Will he commit to matching the federal increase to the child benefit and providing some form of top-up to the income support in order to protect Alberta families otherwise facing fiscal challenges?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we saw the federal package only a few hours ago. The Department of Finance and Treasury Board are working on a detailed analysis of where there may be gaps which the Government of Alberta could potentially fill. But we will be announcing additional measures that we are finalizing as we speak later this afternoon. I would ask the Leader of the Opposition to understand that we have public servants literally working around the clock on these issues, as quite frankly our elected leaders as well, doing our best to deliver that support as soon as we possibly can.
The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would assume that there has been some conversation between provincial governments and the federal government to date, and so some of that work would have been underway. Alberta employers who are still open are struggling to make their payroll. We've seen that the federal government has offered payroll subsidies of up to 10%. We know, again, that that is welcome, but it's a clear place where it's probably not going to be enough. So my question again to the Premier is whether he will commit to matching the federal contribution or perhaps even adding beyond that to provide subsidies to small business owners who are staying open and still supporting their workers.
Premier.
Mr. Speaker, our first priority is to protect people and their health. Our second priority is to protect their financial well-being. And our third priority is to protect the broader economy, including the future of many businesses that are now employers that are now under massive stress. We are moving forward on a broad range of measures across the economy. Not all of those things will be in a position to be announced today. I expect a series of announcements over the days and frankly the weeks to come. Right now we are facing a cash crisis for households and businesses. Then there will be a broader economic crisis from which we must recover. We must take every step in its own time.
The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And on the matter of prioritized issues that need to be addressed, on the same day the Premier declared a public health emergency, he also passed a budget that cut $460 million from healthcare, taking into account population growth and inflation. Now, part of that budget is an absolute cut of $72 million from seniors' drugs benefits, including 60,000 older Albertans who no longer have coverage. Does the Premier plan to continue to withdraw this support to the most vulnerable sections of Alberta's populations going forward?
The Premier.
So let me be blunt, Mr. Speaker. Given the crisis with which we are dealing, which is deteriorating seriously by the hour today, I will no longer tolerate that kind of divisive and dishonest rhetoric from the Leader of the Opposition. It has to end. Trying to scare people at a time of great public anxiety must end now. Sending out emails, trying to raise money for a party off of COVID must end now. Trying to create problems for government coping to deal with this crisis must end now. There was an increase of $600 million in the health budget, not a cut.
The Leader of the Official Opposition.
What must start now, Mr. Speaker, are genuine, authentic answers to questions that are being asked. The budget that we passed last night has a clear plan to cut $72 million from the coverage of seniors' pharmaceutical costs, Mr. Speaker. It is a reasonable question to ask whether, under the current circumstances, seniors will still be asked to pay that or not. Will they or won't they? I will not be bullied out of asking questions on behalf of Albertans.
The Honourable the Premier.
It's like they're living on a different planet than most Albertans, Mr. Speaker. Listen to that. The heckling, the division, the derision. Mr. Speaker, I've got the budget right here. Last year, $20.4 billion in health spending. This per capita level in Canada. Please, to the NDP, stop trying to scare people in the midst of a crisis.
Hear, hear. Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what people find scary are the few details that have been provided, some of which are included in the budget that was passed last night. One of those details is a plan to cut $72 million from the cost of otherwise subsidizing pharmaceutical health care for seniors in Alberta. So it is a reasonable question. Is that still the plan, or will the government support seniors who need to get pharmaceutical health care now more than ever?
The Leader, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, once again, this government is increasing support for health care. This government will be announcing a series of measures in the days and weeks to come to focus financial support to get cash into the bank accounts and the pockets and on the kitchen tables of families who have been laid off, who are having to take time off of work because of self-quarantine or self-isolation. And we'll be joining the federal government in this series of measures, Mr. Speaker, and I ask the Leader of the Opposition to wait for today's announcement at 4 o'clock and subsequent announcements. Hear, hear.
The Leader of the Official Opposition for her third set of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are many different public servants who essentially who are providing essential services across this province in healthcare and in other places. For example, we have people who, for the GOA, who are working in the remand centre, who are processing AISH payments, who are going into homes to protect children. The question I have for the Premier is simple. They are essential, but they need special procedures to keep them safe. Can the Premier tell the people of this House whether those procedures are in place, and will he publish them either in the House or otherwise?
The Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, obviously public health officials work with the broader public service, in part through Executive Council and the Public Service Commission, to ensure that people who need it, who are performing essential services, have access, for example, to personal protection equipment. That has to be done on a prioritized basis, because there is, while we believe we do have adequate supplies to deal with the pandemic, we can't take that for granted. There has to be a careful management of the inventories of PPE, Mr. Speaker, and our officials are tasked with that job.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, but that's not, again, exactly what I asked. We have thousands and thousands of Government of Alberta employees who would be described as providing essential services, who must be at work, and in so doing, put themselves at risk in contrast to what is being recommended by the Chief Medical Officer of Health. And they have not yet been provided with any kind of guidance about how they will fulsomely be able to keep themselves safe. And so my question is simply this: will the Premier, if he can't provide those details here, table those details in the House or otherwise post them publicly so that everyone can see them?
The Honourable the Premier has the call.
Mr. Speaker, the Public Service Commission and managers in the public sector are responsible for exactly that, for ensuring that proper safety protocols are followed, that those are clearly in place. Mr. Speaker, of course, this is a situation that is unfolding by the day, and perhaps it's possible that in some corners of government, managers have not passed on this information that's all readily available from Alberta Health Services.
The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the information is not readily available because this is an absolutely unprecedented situation. So whether you are a corrections officer in the remand center, whether you are a child protection worker called to go into the house of a home where you don't know if people are infected or not infected, whether you are working in a homeless center, whether you are processing AISH payments and dealing with people in line, the fact of the matter is there are not rules for this, and they have not been put in place yet, and people are desperately worried. Will the Premier commit to tabling those rules in the House when they're ready, or otherwise publishing them for all to see?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Chief Medical Officer in Alberta Health Services have been providing enormous amounts of information, both for the public sector and the broader civil society, on hygiene and safety protocols. Equipment is available, personal protection equipment is available as needed on an essential service for essential services, as I've stated. Now, Mr. Speaker, there is a finite amount of that equipment. We believe there's a satisfactory amount, but our managers have to be careful in what they distribute to ensure that it's there when we reach the peak of the pandemic.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been over a week since COVID-19 and the oil price crash has wreaked havoc on the economy, but we have not yet seen any action from this government to support small business. Today will be the third day in a row that I rise to ask what this government is doing for small business. But the federal government has announced an $82 billion aid package for workers and businesses struggling to make ends meet. Small businesses have not yet received any answer from this government about what their plans are. Hopefully today will be different. So I'll ask it again. It's been over a week since they committed to something. What is this government doing to support small business?
The Honourable Minister of Finance and President of Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member opposite has stated, businesses in this province are facing unprecedented challenge. We've been certainly in communication with businesses from across the province and across sectors. Their most urgent concern is access to credit and capital, and we've been working with financial institutions, provincial financial institutions, to ensure that they have the flexibility to offer liquidity and capital during this time of need. Mr. Speaker, we will be making additional announcements in the days to come to assist our businesses.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge West.
Well, honestly, Mr. Speaker, the federal government has moved much faster to meet people's needs. Now, the $55 billion of the federal aid package was for tax deferrals, which is all well and good if you're making a profit and paying taxes. But if you're not, like those that I am hearing from, it does nothing for those who are struggling financially right now. So again, to the Premier, will the government commit to providing loan guarantees, short-term credit measures, and banning evictions during this crisis? All you have to do is say yes and get on with the job.
Hey, hey. The Honourable, the Minister of Finance and President of Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, we've been working with provincial regulated banks and credit institutions to ensure that they do have the liquidity and the ability to offer flexibility to their business clients and corporate clients to ensure that their customers can operate outside of covenants and ensure that refinancing can take place where needed. Mr. Speaker, there will be additional measures announced in days to come, but we know right now the acute need is liquidity and access to capital. We're on it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member.
Well, that is not a satisfying answer for the many small businesses that are reaching out to me and my caucus colleagues. Now, I'm hearing from businesses who are losing massive amounts of revenue. They still have to pay operating costs such as labor. They're not making a profit right now. The tax cuts or deferrals will not help them if they're not making a profit. The federal government has introduced wage subsidies of 10%. 10% may not be enough to keep some of these businesses open. So will this UCP government commit to at least matching this commitment by the federal government, be at least as good as Justin Trudeau?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, we are very well aware of the incredible challenge that Alberta businesses and job creators are facing today. And Mr. Speaker, we will be announcing additional measures, measures beyond the liquidity and capital announcements that were made by the federal government. We will be announcing specific provincial measures to improve access to capital and provide fiscal stimulus in the days to come, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sherwood Park. Oh, Peace River.
No.
Central Peace Notley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the outbreak of COVID-19, our province and our world are on the verge of serious social and economic impacts. However, even before COVID-19 pandemic, the Alberta economy was facing several years of economic stagnation, and is why our government was elected with a mandate to get Alberta back on track. Given that Budget 2020 was created prior to the outbreak of COVID-19 and was designed to fulfill our mandate, and given that this government has been in the middle of budget negotiations throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, can the Minister of Finance please explain to this House why an expedited budget process was a necessary measure to take at this time?
Honourable, the Minister of Finance and President of Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member for the question. I think we can all agree this is a time of great uncertainty, and what we need to be certain about is that our frontline services have the funds they need to deliver to Albertans. The expedited budget process was necessary to ensure government services continue uninterrupted. It's a possibility that we won't be able to continue to meet here in this chamber in the near future, and we needed to be prepared for that scenario and ensure that we had an appropriation bill that was passed so essential government services could be delivered after April 1st.
The Honourable, the member for Central Peace Notley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that COVID-19 will likely have negative economic implications for months, if not years to come, and this impact has been felt throughout the constituency I represent in the Peace Country, and given that, at this point, understandably, we are currently unable to fully measure the potential impact of COVID-19 on our economy and, in fact, the world economy, can the Minister please explain to this House how our Alberta government's Budget 2020 will address the economic concerns of Albertans in light of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Good question.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's more important now than ever to have sound, responsible fiscal management. And as has been mentioned, we passed a budget that included a $500 million increase to what was already a record high health budget in Budget 2020. Mr. Speaker, we will be making announcements as early as this afternoon around additional assistance to Alberta businesses, and there will be continuing announcements in the days to come as we understand the effects of the economic challenge and the best measures to meet that challenge.
The Honourable Member for Central Peace Notley.
Given that our Alberta government announced the additional $500 million to be added to the budget for health spending to aid necessary measures in handling COVID-19, and that the budget was passed just last night, and given that the COVID-19 situation is in continual state of change in Alberta and, in fact, around the world as it spreads and health professionals react to those changes, can the Minister of Finance please elaborate on other budget adjustments that this Alberta government is prepared to take or has taken to aid the fight against COVID-19?
The Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Premier announced $60 million will be immediately distributed for services and to groups that support the most vulnerable in this province. Mr. Speaker, included in Budget 2020 were fiscal stimulus measures such as a virtual record infrastructure capital spending program, a program where we're moving forward key capital initiatives where Albertans can get put back to work. Mr. Speaker, we've also announced additional funding to the Orphan Well Association to ensure that jobs can be created in those regions that need them most.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert is rising with a question.
Yesterday, the Premier announced emergency funding to municipalities and nonprofit organizations that are providing services to vulnerable Albertans. This is a step in the right direction. However, the Premier did not mention how the government would be making up for the $45 million in cuts to employment income supports in the budget they ran through last night. So to the Minister of Community and Social Services, how will your government cover the shortfall built into your fictional budget that contains projections that are at least likely $15 billion off in terms of deficit?
The Honourable Minister of Finance. The Minister of Community and Social Services.
Thank you to the member for that question. Mr. Speaker, the benefits for income support, for expected to work and barriers to full employment, those are legislated benefits, and those will be available to vulnerable Albertans who are eligible for them. So those are irrespective of any budgetary implications and I'm not even sure exactly what shortfall the member is referring to, but in particular to those supports, those are legislated benefits, and people who are eligible for them will receive them.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert.
Given that I know what the shortfall is, it's $45 million in a line item in the budget. To the Minister, how do you plan to support Albertans who will not have access to the income supports due to the budget cuts of like 25% over the next 3 years? There are going to be real ramifications of what's happening right now and what will keep happening for months. So we need some real answers. Albertans are home, a lot of them isolating. They want to hear from you.
The Honourable Minister of Community and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to take this opportunity right now, right here and right now, to speak to Albertans and say that we are going to take care of vulnerable Albertans. Income support is available for eligible clients, and those emergency support payments are available to anybody who might need them. I want to emphasize this again, to stop trying to create fear in vulnerable Albertans. We are going to take care of them.
Hear, hear. Member for St. Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that it's not fear and smear when it's a budget that we passed, that we went through estimates, that we looked at the lines, we asked questions, we know it's $45 million less. It doesn't matter how you spin it, Mr. Speaker, it's less. Please tell Albertans, tell them about eligibility, tell them who's going to be eligible. Be clear, tell them anyone that needs it will get it, and then we'll be good. I'll stop asking, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member, Minister of Community and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not even going to answer that question. I'm just going to say anybody who's eligible for these supports, they are going to get these supports. And I also want to reiterate, yesterday this government announced $60 million in additional funding to help Albertans, vulnerable Albertans right here and right now. $30 million is going to FCSS to get to vulnerable Albertans. $25 million is going to homeless shelters and CBOs, and $5 million is going to emergency women's shelters.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alberta economy and oil and gas sector is dealing with the impact of a number of factors, including the coronavirus pandemic and the low oil prices. Energy companies are reducing their capital spending, and the Premier himself reported that there will be layoffs. So what specific steps will the Energy Minister be taking to make sure the supports are available to the energy worker laid off during these difficult times, and when will you announce them, and why is it taking so long to act?
The Honourable, the Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. I agree with the synopsis that he's set out, that our energy sector is in a crisis. Mr. Speaker, I met last week with over 65 different companies and organizations to understand the impact, and by the day it was getting more and more serious. Even today, it's more serious now than it was this morning. WCS was trading around $7.50. Mr. Speaker, we're working with the industry, we're working with the Finance and the Minister of Finance and Treasury Board to bring forward a full package.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall.
Given that those who have been laid off or those who are facing potential layoff are looking to this government to take action and not wait for the federal government, and given that the only concrete action this government has taken when it comes to the energy industry is to vote to fund their embarrassing war room at a time when workers are worried about paying for their rent, utilities, and mortgages, will the minister agree to defund the war room and use that money to support energy workers who are facing layoffs? Doesn't she think that's a better use of that money?
I do. Say yes. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, we are focused full-time on finding solutions to help the energy sector. Over the past week, myself and my department came up with over 44 different ideas and proposals to consider and move forward. We're testing those. We're making sure that they're not duplicated by the federal government, and we'll be announcing a full package that will help our energy sector. Mr. Speaker, it is so important that we have a vibrant and functioning energy sector as we move through this crisis.
Honourable member for Calgary-McCall.
Given that the War Room has not posted anything on its website since March 11, and given that the Premier expressed serious concerns about the prospects of layoff in the industry that could emerge from this crisis, and given that the Albertans, including the Energy Minister, I hope would agree that supports energy workers facing layoff and the families during these difficult times would be a better use of $82,000 per day that this War Room is spending. Can the Energy Minister explain why she prioritized War Room funding over providing supports for the workers in the energy industry?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, while the members opposite are focusing on using a health crisis to fundraise, we are focused on finding solutions to help the energy sector and all Albertans move forward in spite of this crisis. Mr. Speaker, they are taking shots at creating a partisan effort to create fear and chaos. Mr. Speaker, we are working on solutions to help keep our energy sector viable.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park.
COVID-19 is an unprecedented global pandemic that we find ourselves navigating on a day-to-day basis. Our government is taking action to help slow the spread of COVID-19 and protect public health. The Alberta Chief Medical Officer is advising that if you are not feeling well, to stay home and self-isolate. An increasing number of people live alone, and many feel they have insufficient family and personal supports to get them through. To the Minister of Community and Social Services, what social supports are available to those that feel isolated or are struggling with their mental health as a result of COVID-19?
The Honourable Minister of Community and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, I understand that this is an extremely stressful time and people may not know where to turn. To all Albertans, I want to say you are not alone. We care about you and we're here to help you. Yesterday, we announced $60 million in COVID-19 social services funding. Of this, we're dedicating $30 million to organizations that are providing supports to those who are isolated. These projects include home support for seniors, such as picking up groceries or medicine, prescriptions, supports for mental health counseling via phone, and ramping up information.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that parents in my riding of Sherwood Park and throughout this province are adapting to the increased measures announced in order to flatten the curve and reduce the spread of COVID-19, with all licensed childcare facilities, out-of-school care programs, and preschools closed, to the Minister of Children's Services, what advice and supports do you have for parents as they navigate having discussions with their children around what is happening and working to establish a new daily routine?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Chief Medical Officer of Health said a few days ago, we should absolutely be talking to our kids about this, answering their questions as best we can, and giving them simple steps to follow. With my own kids, that's meant good hand washing and explaining how we can limit the spread of germs in a calm and reassuring way. Mr. Speaker, I also know that many parents are looking for other childcare options right now, including private childcare providers. While these providers can stay open for up to 6 children, Mr. Speaker, I encourage parents to be cautious and make informed decisions. We will continue to support parents as well as the childcare sector through this unprecedented.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that COVID-19 has now been declared a public health emergency, and given that our government is taking the pandemic extremely seriously and is working to act quickly to not only address the direct impacts of the virus, but also the indirect impacts by supporting vulnerable Albertans, can the Minister of Community and Social Services please explain what measures the government is taking to support charitable and non-profit social service organizations in addressing the COVID-19 public health crisis?
The Honourable Minister of Community and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, civil society organizations play such a vital role in supporting and caring for our communities. and we need to rely on each other now more than ever. We've just had a second meeting with the Premier's Council on Charities and Civil Society to help mobilize these efforts. We are in ongoing contact with social service providers and public health issues to address these ongoing needs, and we're also anticipating emerging needs.
For Edmonton Northwest has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UCP projected 698 jobs lost at post-secondary institutions with their last two budgets. But just in the last few weeks, for example, we had SAIT with 230, NAIT with 240, and the University of Alberta projecting 1,000. So that's just with three institutions. That's more than 1,470 positions being lost, double what the UCP was predicting. So based on the budget that this government passed last night, I'm sure that they actually made calculations of how many jobs are actually going to be lost in our post-secondary institutions. I think the minister owes us an explanation.
The Minister of Advanced Education.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Job losses are never easy, and I've been in touch, of course, with senior administration at the affected institutions, and I know that they're taking appropriate steps to help ensure that there's appropriate transition for those individuals that are affected. Of course, we're going through very challenging and unprecedented times, which is why it's critical that we maintain strong and open lines of communication with our post-secondary institutions so that we can work together to provide our students with the academic programming they need.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, given that this government's so-called blueprint for jobs talks about training and retraining programs to help unemployed and underemployed Albertans obtain the skills that they needed, now more than ever we need this training. And given that these plans and hopes to increase skilled trades training at secondary and post-secondary levels, how does this government think that cutting positions at post-secondary institutions like NAIT and SAIT will actually help us now? I would ask him if he could please put a freeze on post-secondary layoffs immediately.
The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the member's correct, and as he knows that strengthening apprenticeship learning in the province is a top priority for the Ministry of Advanced Education and for the Government of Alberta as a whole. Just the other day, I had the opportunity to connect with our task force on apprenticeship learning. We are committed to strengthening the apprenticeship system within the province of Alberta, not just, of course, in its current state, but we're also being proactive in terms of thinking of the future of the apprenticeship system and looking at new and emerging industries to ensure we're building a stronger connection between education and jobs.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to the Finance Minister, we have seen an unprecedented loss of course, all of our post-secondary institutions are closed. And for young people, often having part-time work and so forth, they are in danger of losing jobs, or are already losing jobs as we speak. We saw today that the federal government is looking for provisions for relief for student loans for on the federal level. And I would ask if the Finance Minister could consider putting a pause on the payments required for Alberta student loans immediately.
The Honourable, the Minister of Finance and the President of Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, we recognize that Alberta post-secondary students are going to be challenged in the upcoming days in terms of finding work, even in terms of those that are working part-time now that may be laid off. I would say through you to the member opposite, stay tuned for the announcement this afternoon.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are hundreds of thousands of Alberta students at home today. They're isolated from their friends and their teachers, and they're experiencing incredibly high levels of stress during this pandemic. Every day this week, I've asked the Minister of Education to produce a new plan or any new measures or new programs, anything to support the new mental health pressures on Alberta students. So will the Minister today please tell us a single new thing that the government is doing to address the new student mental health pressures caused by this pandemic?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, our government takes the mental health of all Albertans, including our students, very seriously. We are the first government to have an Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions and have an unprecedented spending commitment of $140 million. School authorities are still receiving their full funding for the upcoming school year and are looking at adapting their existing mental health services to continue to meet the needs of their students. I have full confidence in them. Any student who is struggling is encouraged to contact the Kids Help Phone at 1-800.
The Honourable, the member for Edmonton Glenora.
Mr. Speaker, it's disappointing that after 3 days, we're still getting talking points from 2 weeks ago. Given that students with complex needs are also isolated at home, away from their friends, teachers, and educational assistants, and given that many students will not be able to continue with their education without specialized supports, I'm asking the minister again. This is the third day I've asked this, and the second day in a row I've given you my questions in advance. Where is the minister's plan to support students with complex needs during this pandemic?
Mr. Speaker, as a former rehabilitative practitioner and as the sister of my late brother Lou, who was born with Down syndrome, supporting students with complex needs is my top priority. School authorities across Alberta are working hard to adapt their supports to accommodate their students in new and unprecedented reality. All funding for specialized supports continues to flow, and I have full confidence that our education system will rise to the occasion and meet the needs of their students. I know that every member in this House shares that same confidence. Thank you.
The Honourable Member.
Given that parents and students are reaching out to me saying that they need confidence in this minister and that they don't feel it right now, that she isn't acknowledging the realities of this week's pressures, Mr. Speaker, I find that very disheartening. Given that the government's rammed through a budget last night that will cut as many as 1,400 teachers from Alberta classrooms, and given that teachers are also dealing with a ton of stress right now, keeping themselves and their families safe while supporting students who are trying to learn from home, Minister, please, I've sent you this in advance so you can give these teachers and these family members a real answer. Will you please commit here and now to freeze all teacher layoffs and provide mental health staff support for all staff?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, first off, we're proud and we are depending 100% on our Minister of Education, who's working tirelessly. She's already answered the question, Mr. Speaker, but that honourable member, the acting leader of the NDP, the member from Edmonton and Glenora, sent out a fundraising letter just the other day about the virus, Mr. Speaker, and then said, and I quote, if you can chip in $5 or more, I can promise to put your contribution to work. A political fundraiser on a virus at a historical time in our province when they need the government to stand with them, Mr. Speaker. Shame on that member. Shame on the opposition, Mr. Speaker. It is completely and utterly unacceptable. She should stand up and apologize.
Order, order. All members will come to order. The Honourable Member for Order. The Honourable. It's an untimely phone call, isn't it? The Honourable Member for Calgary North has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID-19 pandemic is unfolding quickly, and there are multiple...
The honourable members will come to order. If they'd like to have a private conversation, they're welcome to use the lounges, because the honourable member for Calgary North has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID-19 pandemic is unfolding quickly, and there are multiple updates coming throughout the day from the provincial and federal governments. However, many of our most vulnerable groups do not have stable or continuous access to services like cable or internet. To the Minister of Culture, what is the government doing in terms of outreach to groups that do not use traditional forms of media?
The Honourable Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My office is sending translations directly to cultural organizations, and also I'd like to thank the MLAs and ministers for their coordinated effort with ethnic media. It's been very meaningful. It's been a true privilege working with the faith leaders and community leaders who are doing direct outreach with their communities, and I'd like to give a special shout out to the Islamic group, MAC Islamic Association, that is doing a blood drive right now. As Dr. Hinshaw has said, it is safe to donate blood, and they're doing that grassroots work right now. Thank you very much to them.
The Honourable Member for Calgary North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Given that many newcomers consume media in their native language, given that daily updates are only available in English, and further, given that many newcomers are not familiar with our emergency management processes? To the Minister of Health, what is the government doing to provide updates to newcomers that have limited English capabilities?
The Honourable, the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. AHS is actively translating public health information into Alberta's most common language to keep Albertans informed. Dr. Dina Hinshaw, the Chief Medical Officer of Health, is also being assisted in her press conferences now with translation into ASL. This includes messaging for AHS and signage in their healthcare facilities, signage in airports, frequently asked questions, providing COVID-19 guidance for Albertans. These languages are Spanish, Arabic, traditional Chinese, Punjabi, Tigrinya, simplified Chinese, French, and Vietnamese. Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Calgary North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that this virus came to Canada due to foreign travel, given that there are real fears and high anxiety regarding COVID-19 in Alberta, and further given that Alberta is a diverse and culturally rich province, to the Minister of Health, how can we ensure people are protecting themselves but do not discriminate against particular groups of people?
Honourable, the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government stands for an open society and against discrimination in any form. Our values will be tested in the weeks to come, and we will pass that test. We're in this together. That's our message to Albertans. That's not just rhetoric. It's the key to an effective response to this pandemic. The reality is we cannot treat our way out of this pandemic. We all need to act now to reduce our risk and to slow the spread of the virus so that the hospitals can keep up with the peak of serious cases when they come, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Edmonton-Whitemud has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Most Alberta families are struggling to adapt to a new reality. Schools and daycares have been closed since Monday for good reason, and it is impossible to predict when they will be open again. For many parents, working from home is not an option. These parents may be required to stay home with their children, even if they are not sick or self-isolating. This morning, the federal government announced it would be increasing support through the Canada Child Benefit. The official opposition is calling on this government to likewise increase the Alberta Child Benefit to support Alberta families. Can the Minister of Children's Services commit to doing this? And if not, what specific supports will she be providing to parents who cannot work due to childcare obligations?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past number of days, we have been speaking with parents and child care centre operators across the province as we recognize that this is a very uncertain and unprecedented situation. Mr. Speaker, as a number of my colleagues have mentioned, there will be more to come on the Alberta government's path forward and what we have to offer the citizens of Alberta, from businesses to families, and stay tuned for 4 o'clock today.
Right. The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Whitemud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that childcare providers across Alberta are still struggling to find out what the pandemic will mean for their centres, their families, and their staff, and given that on Monday the minister said she would provide additional direction through calls with childcare operators and told operators she would have regular calls with them in the future, can the minister update this House on what substantive information she provided to operators on Monday about closures due to the pandemic, and will the minister commit to sharing the information she's discussing with operators through regular updates to this House?
Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the opportunity to provide an update to this House on that front right now. I did speak with more than 900 childcare centre operators on Monday by phone to answer some of their questions. As you can appreciate, Mr. Speaker, we make decisions based on the advice of Dr. Dina Hinshaw, the Chief Medical Officer of Health, and we recognize that this is a very uncertain time, both for childcare centre operators, frontline childcare workers, as well as parents across the province. We are scheduling another one of those calls to update centres as promised.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you. I think this House would be interested in hearing a little bit more about those updates as they happen. So given that some operators are unable to pay staff or keep up with operating costs like rent and utilities, as they will no longer be collecting childcare fees for the time being, and given that operators will be likely forced to lay off staff while they remain closed, and given that parents should not be charged for childcare services they aren't receiving, but that also cannot even be offered at this time, how will the minister ensure that parents and childcare operators will get through this uncertain time with our strong, necessary, and critical childcare system intact at the end?
Minister.
Very
much, Mr. Speaker. That is exactly what we committed to childcare center operators on Monday when I spoke with them. Mr. Speaker, again, this is an unprecedented situation, and it changes by the day based on the advice that we receive from the Chief Medical Officer of Health. I do understand that this is an exceptional circumstance, again, both for childcare centers as well as parents. Many centers are choosing to waive fees, have refunded parents. I have encouraged them to, in fact, not charge parents for services that they are not receiving. And Mr. Speaker, I have committed to working with childcare centers to see them through this so that they are there to provide services to parents.
The honourable member for Edmonton-McClung has a question.
Mr. Speaker, Alberta's economy has been hit hard by a number of issues ranging from coronavirus to lower oil prices, and no one has been exempt or immune from these challenging times, including our farm and ranch communities. Our farmers and ranchers feed Alberta and the world, and they require our support to get through these difficult times. Will the Minister of Agriculture inform this House what new supports he and his government will be making available for our agricultural producers during this crisis?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member opposite for that very important question. AFSC program continues to support farmers. There's over $700 million that's still expected to be paid out to farmers after the very difficult season. There's almost 1 million acres that is still under snow as we speak, but we are reviewing additional relief, whether it be through interest-only payments, payment deferrals, or re-amortization of loans with farmers that have loans with AFSC, as well as farmers that have insurance with AFSC. We're looking at extending the insurance deadlines for farmers.
Honourable member for Edmonton-McClung.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Farmers are anxiously awaiting these new facilities because they are in challenging times indeed. Now, given that Alberta's agricultural products are world-class and make up a significant portion of Alberta's trade, but given that we are seeing the closures of borders as a measure to prevent the spread of coronavirus, and given the impact that these necessary measures could have on our agricultural producers, how is the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry keeping farmers informed of developments, and will he be taking further actions should border closures impact the bottom lines of Alberta producers?
Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And we all saw today that the border between Canada and the U.S. is closed. That's $1.7 billion worth of trade that is still being able to continue, which is a great sign for our agriculture sector here in Alberta and across Canada. But the fact that we have not lost market access to the United States or any countries around the world is a good thing, obviously. And I would encourage farmers, as well as all Albertans, to pay attention to Dr. Hinshaw, our Alberta Chief Medical Officer of Health, to make sure that they are getting daily updates, because this is a very dynamic situation that does change at a very frequent rate.
The honourable member.
Timely mention of Dr. Hinshaw, Mr. Speaker. Given that Alberta has internationally renowned livestock, including world-class beef, pork, and poultry industries, and given that many of these animals require around-the-clock care and assistance, and given the concerns of the possibility of the need for self-isolation and other such measures, what is the advice for farmers and their workers on their farms in self-isolation, and how is the government planning to help them tend to their farms and maintain a labour supply?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I would encourage farmers to listen to Alberta's health specialists and to put their own health and safety first. And unfortunately, most models indicate that this pandemic will last all calving season and actually peak during spring seeding. And we want to make sure that it was very important last night, actually, that we passed the budget so that the funds from this government will be able to go to farmers and to all Albertans combating this pandemic.
The honourable member for Highwood has a question.
Mr. Speaker, over the past few days, we've seen and heard stories of Albertans stocking up on groceries and other essential items. Most people are stocking up to ensure their family is prepared in case they need to self-isolate for 14 days. Some are stocking up to donate and help others. But we've also heard reports that others are attempting to unfairly profit from shortages. To the Minister of Service Alberta, can you please inform this House of any measures this government is taking with regards to this issue?
The Honourable, the Minister of Service Alberta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for the question. Like all members here, Mr. Speaker, I'm disappointed to hear stories of people taking advantage of COVID-19 to personally profit. And we're asking Albertans not to take advantage of this situation and of people's concerns over COVID-19, but instead to work together to ensure that Alberta and Albertans come out of this stronger together. While the Consumer Protection Act doesn't cover private sales like this, common sense and decency should. And we urge all Albertans to act with consideration and caution and to find ways to help support one another in this time.
The Honourable Member for Highwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for that answer. Given that some Albertans have experienced ridiculous price markups across the province, and given that in the wake of the COVID-19 health crisis, people are already strained for money, to the same Minister, what protections are in place for Albertans, and what can Albertans do when they identify unreasonable prices on necessities?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Alberta.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Consumer Protection Act prevents suppliers from making excessive price increases with no reasonable explanation. And so if Albertans have examples, specific examples of stores or businesses that they believe have unnecessarily raised their prices for products and services in Alberta simply because of COVID-19, then they should report it through our Report a Ripoff phone line or our website. They can do that at 1-877-427-4088 or at alberta.ca. This is not a new regulation because of COVID-19. It has been the law in Alberta for many years.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and once again, thank you to the Minister. Given that it appears as though it's only a small minority taking advantage of the current pandemic, and given that the people of Alberta are strong, generous, and resilient, and given that we have already seen and heard amazing acts of charity and kindness, can the Minister please provide examples of unique solutions that might deliver additional aid for our seniors and our most vulnerable here in the province?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank and commend all Albertans who are stepping out to help one another in this challenging time. Some Albertans are stepping up on Facebook, like the Airdrie Helping Neighbours or the Strathcona County COVID-19 support pages, where people are writing in with requests for or offers to supply assistance. I've seen a poster for Crescent Heights Community in Calgary that encourages helping each other out. And retailers like Belmont Sobeys in Edmonton are opening their doors early to provide a less busy and less stressful shopping experience for seniors, mobility impaired and vulnerable populations. I want to commend all Albertans who are making a difference. Thank you.
Good.
Tabling returns and reports.
Seeing none. Honourable members, I have one tabling this afternoon, the requisite 6 copies of a memorandum from the Honourable Government House Leader regarding the extension of sitting times. It states, please accept this memo as a notice required pursuant to Government Motion 10, agreed to on March 17, 2020, that the public interest requires the Assembly to sit beyond the normal adjournment hour on Thursday, March 19th.
I wish to advise the Assembly that the following document was deposited with the Office of the Clerk. On behalf of Honourable Minister LaGrange, Minister of Education, pursuant to the Legislative Assembly Act and the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Act, Education Annual Report Update 2018-19.
I see the Honourable Government House Leader rising. We're not at orders of the day yet. I also am excited because, Honourable members, we are at orders of the day, orders du jour. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to just do 2 simple things and then move for consent of the Assembly. First is this, pursuant to Standing Order 3.1.2, I wish to advise the Assembly that there shall be no morning sitting tomorrow, Thursday, March 19th, 2020. And pursuant to Government Motion 11, I wish to advise the Assembly that there shall be no evening sitting tonight. And with that said, I rise to ask for unanimous consent of the Assembly to temporarily recess the Assembly until 4:00 p.m. this afternoon.
Well, members, the Government House Leader has requested unanimous consent for a temporary recess to 4:00 this afternoon. I will ask only one question. Is there anyone opposed to unanimous consent? Please say aye. Hearing none. The House stands in recess till 4 o'clock this afternoon.